Welcome to the Arizona Civics Podcast and our series, Understanding State and Local Government, a 10-part mini-lecture series exploring Arizona's history, governance, and civic life. This podcast is designed to provide clear, engaging insights into topics like judicial selection, tribal sovereignty, and direct democracy. Our content expert, Dr. Sean Bienberg, a Phoenix native and scholar of state and federal constitutions, brings deep expertise to this series. Dr. Bienberg serves as the Associate Director of ASU's School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership and is the Director of the Center for American Civics. He is also author of Prohibition, the Constitution and States' Rights, as well as Progressive States' Rights. Let's dive into the systems and stories that shape Arizona's civic life.
So Arizona did not enter the Union with women's suffrage, but it has had it almost since the beginning, and strikingly well before the 19th Amendment made it a uniform federal requirement. One of the very first amendments that Arizonans approved in the 1912 elections in November created a constitutional right of women to vote in Arizona. Now, one thing that's striking is that women's suffrage was not actually present in Arizona in the territorial days, considering that the Mountain West states had tended to be the place in the United States where women's suffrage was the strongest, beginning with Wyoming, which offered women's suffrage in 1869, and continuing basically throughout the later 19th century. It was gradually expanding out, such that by 1914, New Mexico was the only Mountain Western state that didn't have women's suffrage. The 1891 Arizona Constitutional Convention had considered women's suffrage, but rejected it, largely because they were trying to stay very, very cautious in securing statehood in that initial proposal. And in some sense, that's also what happened in 1910. There was plausibly a majority of members of the convention who would have been sympathetic to women's suffrage in and of itself. But the fear was that women's suffrage would not only be controversial in getting the Constitution across the line, but particularly would be controversial because it was thought that it would have likely led to prohibition, which they definitely were afraid of getting attacked as that this would be the prohibition constitution. So ultimately, the drafters of the Arizona Constitutional Convention decided to avoid putting either the issue of women's suffrage or the issue of prohibition into the Constitution, figuring that the voters could deal with that through the initiative amendment process thereafter. And that's exactly what happened. As groups, particularly Frances Willard Munds and her Arizona Equal Suffrage Association, along with Pauline O'Neill, the two of them were largely regarded as the sort of leaders of the suffragette movement, pushed toward securing initiative signatures, as well as an attempt to get the legislature to approve women's suffrage. The legislative effort failed in the first legislature, so they turned toward securing the initiative amendment process. And that's exactly what happened. So they were able to get enough signatures and it went on the ballot and it passed overwhelmingly in 1912, such that Arizona really only had that first set of elections without women's suffrage. Otherwise, it's been a central part of Arizona's political history. And in fact, one could make a case to say that Arizona has had a stronger tradition of women in political leadership than perhaps any other state. Compared to most states, Arizonans have proven much more likely to choose women for positions of political power. So, for example, it has had 2 women serve as Chief Justice and a higher percentage of female governors than any other state. Almost 1 in 4 as of 2022. It was, in fact, 5 of 22 governors. Rose Mofford, Jane D. Hull, Janet Napolitano, Jan Brewer, and Katie Hobbs. Between 2018 and 2020, both of its U.S. senators, Martha McSally and Kirsten Sinema, were women. At one point in the late 1990s, every office in the popularly elected plural executive of the governor, secretary of state, treasurer, attorney general, and superintendent of public instruction, each of those offices was held by a female office holder. And of course, Sandra Day O'Connor is one of Arizona's most famous products. She became the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court after her appointment by Ronald Reagan, but that was after a storied career in Arizona government, serving initially as an assistant attorney general, so therefore in the executive branch, serving in the state legislature, including becoming the Senate majority leader of the Republican caucus, and then after that, entering the state judiciary and eventually ending up as an appellate judge, from which point she was elevated by President Ronald Reagan to then serve on the United States Supreme Court. Her time in the state legislature had led her to be the first woman to head a state legislative caucus in any of the states of the Union.
Thank you for joining us. This series is brought to you by the Center for American Civics at ASU, where we're working to make Arizona a national model for civic education. Special thanks to our content expert, Dr. Sean Byenberg, for his insights. Follow us on social media to stay connected and share your thoughts. We are on social media at ASU Civics on pretty much every platform. Don't forget to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep learning.